Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly O'Horo, and this is Adaptable Behavior Explained. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in today. We are going to talk about a topic that is so relevant and prevalent, and that's repair after conflict in relationships. And I have to say that in pretty much every client, people come in talking about an issue they have with their partner or the way they communicate or have conflict with the partner. They talk about things that are related to how do we, I'm so tired of the cycle. I'm just exhausted from the way that we interact. I hate that we take so long to come back to connection with one another. And I just struggle with that. And, as a therapist, when I have someone on my couch, the guidance is really, I know that it's hard to be in relationship and people are going to do the things that they're going to do. But one thing that's always sure is we can only affect the way that we show up in response to issues in a relationship. And how do we experience and change our direction, our communication, our nervous system, so that we can have better relationships with the data that comes at us in conflict. And so today what I'm hoping to do is share with you ways that we can repair ruptures after conflict, because, we all are in relationships, whether that be personal, with friends, with spouses, with partners, in our work environments. I mean, let's face it, relationships are everywhere. And so I hope this show resonates with you and you find some nuggets that serve you. And if you like the content, please make sure to share and subscribe to the show so that you don't miss further episodes. And it helps us to determine future topics for the show. So with conflict resolution, we understand that there's so many things that can be part of it. And we're going to talk about several of those facets. One of the things that's really important to understand is that our attachment style really affects the way that we interact in relationships. And so we're going to talk a little bit about our attachment styles, not too much. I have a full episode on attachment styles. Highly recommend that you determine yours and figure out what your attachment style is and the attachment style of your partner. The other topic that we're going to talk about is setting boundaries, some communication strategies during and after conflicts. And so grab a pen and a paper, or make sure that you pause in sections and talk with someone that you are in relationship with so that you can apply some of these strategies in your life. So just a quick review on attachment styles. There are secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized attachment styles. And all of them significantly impact our relationships, because we are going to have a propensity to show up in relationships and engage with people in specific ways depending on how we are wired. And so you need to recognize your own style and that of your partner's. If you want to read more about this, there is a great book called Attached, and I highly recommend that to really every one of my clients, especially if they end up in couples work, as a kind of a foundation on who am I and who is my person and how can I expect them to show up. And it also helps us to really understand what guides them. And so I want to talk a little bit more in depth about a specific attachment style and how that might look in conflict. So the most ideal attachment style is our secure attachment, or a secure style. And a person who has a secure attachment, it's not that we don't have conflict. It's just that during conflict, we can remain calm, we can be open, we can remain curious, and we don't necessarily fall into blame so quickly. We're able to express feelings without shame and without shutting down and getting small. And emotions are, of course, at the root of every behavior that we ever did. And so we want to be able to express our emotions and our feelings. And in a secure attachment style, it's a lot easier for someone like that to do that. So something in conflict might sound like, I understand why you're upset. Let's try to find a resolution so that we can mitigate conflict in the future. So there's an opening, there's a curiosity, and there's an opportunity for resolution, and an opportunity for brainstorming a resolution. Someone with an anxious or preoccupied attachment style can be in unrest more easily. They become emotional, they need reassurance, They often fear rejection and abandonment. And it's activating something when in disconnection or when in conflict, where a person starts to feel, uncomfortable and they need the reassurance. And so they're someone who might say something more like, are you mad at me? What did I do? Or they're super sensitive to an expression of disappointment or confusion on someone's face. And they're really nervous about the disconnection. And so if they're mad, can we get through it? This is the person that might even follow someone when they've said, I'm angry, I need a minute. Someone with an anxious attachment style might follow them into the other room because they're so uncomfortable with the disconnection. Then there's the dismissing or the avoidant style of attachment. And so this person is more naturally reluctant to connect. And so they'll downplay conflict. They might withdraw emotionally. These are someone who would say, it's not a big deal, whatever, bygones, whatever it is, let's just move on and let's just move forward. So they're not necessarily wanting to get into the details of the conflict and the disconnection and what happened. Someone with a fearful or avoidant, disorganized style, these people tend to have a more intense emotional experience. They can swing from, I need to be connected with you, and if I feel too close and it gets overwhelming, I might push you away. And so that toggling between the closeness and the fear is part of how someone with a disorganized attachment style will show up in relationship and in conflict. And so they might be feeling simultaneously, I'm angry, but I'm also scared. And so they have a harder time figuring out what balance might need to look like. So I want to give you a little bit of language related to conflict. As an EFT therapist, we often call conflicts ruptures. And so I want to make sure you understand that even when you go to therapy and you have a good handle on all of these concepts, it doesn't mean that relationship is without conflict. All relationship will have disconnection and rupture. And the thing that we want to just realize is we can get better at the repair after rupture. We can have them more infrequently. And we don't become so distressed when we have them because we know we can find our way back to each other. And so a rupture is basically what happens when a connection between two people breaks. And it's often caused by hurt, anger, or oftentimes unmet expectations. And so these are the little things that I hear people say, I shouldn't have to tell them, or they should just know. And I always tell my clients, we shouldn't expect anything without clear and concise communication. So we're going to talk about how both people contribute to a rupture, and I'm going to give you an example. And I've included a little picture here because truthfully, what happens in a rupture is we all want to be in connection. We're hardwired for connection. And what happens in a rupture is we're like this picture from Burning Man, where we're the little boy and the little girl, or the people that are backs to one another, but all we really want is to have connection as an adult. And so you can see in this illustration the disconnection. And so I'm going to use an example that is more of a colleague situation. We're gonna call them Frank and Barry. So Frank and Barry, they run a hardware business together, and recently they invested in a new accounting system that was recommended by Frank. And unfortunately, with all new things, there's risk, and sometimes things are successful and sometimes they fail. Well, in this case, it failed, and there was a cash flow problem that created some disconnection in the partners, but also some struggle in the business. And so Barry has a role. He discovers that there's a botched system. He explodes in rage at Frank. He calls him incompetent. He questions his judgment. And of course, Barry's temper escalated in the conflict. And then we have Frank's role. So Frank made the business mistake, but he also allowed Barry's anger to affect him deeply. And he was ruminating and upset. And instead of seeking repair, he ends up sulking and he waits for an apology. And so both Frank and Barry contribute to the rupture. Barry's explosive reaction and Frank's emotional withdrawal leads to this stalemate. They're both kind of sticking their heels in with their perspective being the right perspective. And I can't tell you how often I see this happening in disconnection. And unfortunately, someone has to has to be the bigger person and take accountability for their part in order to make repair happen. So each person has to assume responsibility for their part of the rupture. They have to acknowledge their emotions, like they were sad, they were angry, they were disappointed. And that helps shift people from blame and defensiveness to that personal accountability where people can take a stance for repair and connection and ultimately curiosity. And so that's just a little example about how everybody has to take part in take responsibility for their part in rupture in order for repair to take place. So next, we're going to talk about something called boundaries. And I know there's a lot of buzz around the word boundaries, but it's really important to understand how boundaries are meant to be used. And I have a full episode on boundaries that I highly encourage you to watch, because people are really mistaking boundaries for walls, and they're misusing the word, and they're also not allowing for a pathway of intimacy and connection, which is really what boundaries are about. So in order to have boundaries in conflict repair, we have to clearly communicate the needs and our boundaries. So I'm going to talk about a couple kinds of boundaries. One might be a timeout boundaries. Let's face it, we all lose our cool at times. We all feel overwhelmed with our emotional experience. And so sometimes we need to call a pause. And so that's a timeout boundary. So during a conflict, we might need to say, I need to take a break to calm down, or I need to just go walk around the block to take a minute. And that helps us to get back in our prefrontal cortex and get into a place where we can use reason and rational decision making and better communication. And we have a broader perspective ability once we're calmed down. And then after a conflict, we need to say, like, let's revisit this concept or this discussion in an hour when we've both cooled off and we're able to have more, where cooler heads will prevail. We might need to set a no yelling boundary. So when someone is yelling or they lose their temper, it's really hard to remain cool. It's really hard to be in a situation where you can be measured and be rational and hear somebody else, because it creates an automatic defensive response. And so you might need to say, during a conflict, like, there's a no yelling boundary. We need to keep our voices down, or I'm having a hard time keeping measured in this conversation as you raise your voice. And after the conflict, we need to revisit it and say, remember, we have an agreement that we're not going to raise our voices so that we can get through conflict. All relationships will have some constructive tension when done well. And also, we grow through the discomfort. We gain a better understanding of one another. We tend to have more connection and intimacy when we've come through repair. And so it's important to recognize that boundaries are part of any good relationship. We want to make sure that we have a respectful communication boundary. And so when we start to put jabs in and be passive aggressive, we're shutting our partner down. We're creating a defensive stance. And so during a conflict, a communication boundary might look like, we can discuss this, but I really can't do the name calling, or we've agreed that we weren't going to shame one another and put each other down. So let's look at that for communication boundaries. And then after the conflict, we need to circle back and we need to be able to say, I felt hurt when you called me names, and I noticed myself shutting down and really wanting to avoid future conflict or future discussion about this. And I felt really alone. And so we need to be able to express our emotional experience after the conflict when it comes to communication. That's part of healthy repair. Of course, in all relationships, effective communication is necessary. And so this is a common thing that almost every therapist will discuss, but I'm going to dig in a little bit deeper. So we want to use I statements to express our feelings. Anytime we start with you, or you always, or you never, we are pretty much going to hit a wall, because it creates and elicits a defensive response in our listener. And so we want to take responsibility for our emotional experience. I felt really overwhelmed and hurt when you called me a name. And the story I make up is that you don't respect me at all, and you don't want to be nice to me. And about that, I felt overwhelmed and hurt. And I really want to I want to be in communication with you, but I need you to be more respectful to me, because that's not working for me. So we can use I statements in effective ways, and it allows our listener to remain open. And we want to make sure we stay focused on the issue at hand. We don't want to bring in all the past grievances when we're in an experience, because quite frankly, when we do that, it's kind of a stockpiling tactic, and that starts to create defensiveness in our listener as well. So we want to validate each other's experiences. We want to keep things focused on the issue, and we want to be self-responsible about our communication. Another thing that's really important in conflict is acknowledging the hurt and owning our role. And so when we're in disconnection, all of us are hurt. Most people are hurt. They might act more angry, but underneath that anger is hurt. So we want to be honest about our emotional impact. I know I showed up really angry, but really what it is I feel so helpless that I can't get through to you. And then I lost my temper. So take responsibility for our part in conflict. And that leaves a window open for your partner or the person you're in conflict with to also take responsibility. Also take responsibility and accountability for our part in whatever the conflict's about. So let's say, I come home from work and the kitchen's full of dishes or the sink's full of dishes. I get angry and I lose my temper with my partner. And, they get defensive and they say, you don't know all the things that I do. But when the dust settles, we need to say, I'm sorry that I took out my overwhelm from the day on you about the dishes. And my partner might say, and I apologize for not contributing equally to the household chores. I realize that, I need to take responsibility for doing my own dishes as well and things like that. So we want to avoid blame and criticism because that just creates a defensive stance in the person, and it's ineffective. We want to focus on solutions rather than blaming each other. So instead of saying, you always leave the dishes in the sink, you might want to say, let's find a way to resolve the overwhelm related to all of our daily tasks and figure out, a plan for the future so that we can have all of our home needs met. Ultimately, this opens us up for co-creation and preventing future conflicts. So we get better clarity and understanding about how the rupture happened in the first place, how they were co-created, how we both played a part, and recognize we have to clean up our side of the street because with all conflict, there's a 50-50 responsibility in the situation. We want to discuss how conflict triggers us so that we can prevent future conflicts from becoming so eruptive. And we're going to talk a little bit about some specific keys to repair relationships after conflict, along with some examples for how we want to move through things. So ultimately, we want to always create active listening and validation. And so even if someone is saying something that you just completely don't agree with, we need to say, I really feel compassion for you that you had that emotional experience. And I'm really sorry that happened for you. And we want to listen actively to their perspective without interrupting and then validate the feelings that they had or the experiences that they had. And we need to take that accountability for our part in it. So it's kind of like, I understand that my behavior hurt you and I'm sorry that I didn't better consider your feelings. And then when we apologize, it needs to be sincere. We don't want to be just checking a box, and we want to be genuine. You want to acknowledge your mistake. You want to express remorse. You want to mean it when you say, I'll continue to work on that evolution of my part in how we have conflict. So if I raised my voice, I might want to say, I'm sorry that I raised my voice during our argument. It wasn't respectful, and you deserve better treatment than that. I hope you can forgive me. And so it's genuine. Always when we're in a growing stance and we want to improve, we have to reflect. We have to have self-reflection. So we need to go, what was my part in it? And reflect on our behavior, our triggers that activated the way that we showed up, and understand how our past experiences influence our reactions during conflict. We all have a past that clouds our lenses and how we view the world. And so when we are unaware that our past contributes to how we show up, then we're bound to continue behaving in the same way that we have, because we're not learning, we're not taking accountability, we're not reflecting. So when we reflect on our triggers, we want to think about what got me about those dishes in the sink. What was it that so bothered me? And when I think about it, it's like, well, I've had to be so ultra responsible my whole life because of however my parents were. And when I see the dishes, it's just this reminder that, see, here I am again, having to take care of everything on my own. And that voice that I hear in my head, that's part of my history that says, I'm resentful and I'm jaded from things that I've had to take responsibility for in my past. And I'm kind of taking that former feeling of responsibility out on my current partner. Because when I slow down and I think about it, my partner more than pulls their weight. They more than do their fair share in our relationship. So my reaction to that dishes situation really had nothing to do with that moment. It's a buildup of my history, and it created a defensive response. So part of our self-reflection is owning our role, recognizing our history, and taking accountability for our part, and that we contribute equally to our rupture. And by acknowledging our part in conflict, we can create space for understanding and for repair. Now, that leads to what do we want to do in the future so that we have better understanding as partners, whether it's business or friendships or in romantic relationships. And that's having a clear understanding of our needs and our expectations and communicating those openly to the person that we're in relationship with. So if I'm feeling lonely and disconnected because my husband and I are like two ships passing in the night. We're both slammed with our schedules. It's my responsibility to say, I really need more quality time together. Can we schedule some regular date nights, especially in the midst of all these projects we have going on? Otherwise, I feel like we're getting lost in disconnection. And ultimately, I always recognize that when we're in disconnection, it's probably because one of our basic needs are not being met. And we haven't had enough time together. And so we have to make sure that we express our needs. And then it's really a good idea to create some repair rituals. So maybe an example would be like, after we have conflict and we reconnect, let's make sure we hug and we say, I love you after every disagreement. And that becomes part of our closure and our nervous system understanding that this is over and this is what we do when we're in reconnection. And this helps us to rebuild trust gradually over time, because that's what's true is all relationships have conflict and ruptures, but rebuilding and repairing does take time. And so we want to make sure that to rebuild our trust, that we're consistent in our actions, and that will help us better build trust in our relationship and ultimately in our nervous system, to trust that we get better, we come back together, and we're going to be okay. And so we want to make sure that we build connection and transparency about what we're needing, and talk to our partner about, I'll be more transparent about my feelings moving forward. We want to express appreciation, especially when we get this right. Not so much getting life right, but getting our repair from the rupture right. So we want to show gratitude for our partner's efforts. Thanks for being patient with me during our last argument. I know that this pattern is frustrating and that it can be exhausting, but I just really appreciate you continuing to work with me so that we can be back in connection as fast as possible, and that we can both take accountability for what we do in our side of the street. Now, all of this is really helpful and useful, but ultimately, sometimes we need a third person to be objective, or a second person if we just do individual counseling. So make sure that you seek professional help and consider working with a therapist or a counselor, because they can guide you through the repair process and provide valuable insights to you about your part. Or if you do couples work, the couple is the client in that case. And so the therapist's job is to kind of really equally provide insight for both partners' part in the conflict and their negative interaction cycle. And so it's always good to get that objective vantage point. I highly recommend it. I know that it's been so completely helpful in my personal life, in my personal work, in my relationship with my spouse. We've had excellent help with EFT couples therapists, as well as our own EMDR trauma-focused individual therapists. And it's really helped us to improve the way that we relate. And it's definitely been, hugely helpful in the clients' lives that I've been lucky enough to work with, because they are able to then see their part and they're able to course correct so that their ruptures and repair can happen more quickly. So you need to remember, self-awareness, open communication lead to healthier conflict resolution. Ultimately, it takes practice. It's progress, not perfection. And I hope that you're all finding something useful from this episode. So thank you so much for tuning in. Keep working on those repairs in your relationships. And until we meet again next time, don't forget to lead with love, because it'll never steer you wrong.